Good afternoon. Good afternoon, and well done for sticking with us. Plenty of CPD on offer for you, no doubt, if you're still watching me. I'm going to be dealing with the updates to the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions England Regulations 2020, which by now I can just about manage to say without checking the reference for myself. And we're looking really at updates and amendments to Regulation 6, dealing with restrictions on movement, and Regulation 7, which deals with restrictions on gatherings. The law's current as at the 1st of June, Monday of this week. And there's a caveat which should pop up on the screen in a moment, but it goes without saying that this isn't public health advice. There's a link on the screen, or which will appear on the screen, I hope, in a moment, to the government advice, but I know we all know where to find it. And the point is the regulations are really the spine of the approach to combating the coronavirus in England and more widely as well. And the idea is that they oughtn't really to need to be used if we're all complying with the guidance, which generally speaking is more restrictive than the regulations that have been imposed. So with that caveat, if we go on to the next slide and just touch upon the requirement for review, there's a 3-weekly period within which all reviews need to be conducted of the regulations. If any of the restrictions or requirements are no longer needed for the specified purpose, they must be terminated. You have there on the screen the specified purpose. It's found in Regulation 3.3 of the regs. Over onto the next slide, and if we can just click through these very quickly, you can see there the amendments that have already been made and when they have been made. So if you want to check back and see what the law was, those are the references for you to see what the law was at the time of any particular historic event you may be interested in. Moving now to the meat of the talk, really. Next slide deals with the amendment to Regulation 6.1. And this is the restriction on movement. This is the regulation that, when originally enacted, said you couldn't leave your house subject to a reasonable excuse, and so commonly cited as the most draconian use of government power during peacetime. The arguments for and against the use of it, but we all understood the underlying purpose. So originally it was drafted as there. The words underlined were added in the most recent amendments prior to the last lot, just under a month ago. And the new Regulation 6.1 is going to pop up on the screen in a moment. And the amendment there, we're all aware of it in general terms. So rather than saying you can't leave your house without a reasonable excuse, the law now provides that you may not stay overnight at any place other than the place where you're living without a reasonable excuse. So a loosening there, of course, of the restrictions. On to the next slide to see what that actually means. It's up there on the screen. You can now legally leave your home for any purpose. You don't have to check before you go out, does what I am about to do comply with the law? You can leave your home for any purpose now. And you can stay out for as long as you like during the daytime, even after your initial purpose for leaving has been completed, you can stay out. But what you can't do, of course, is stay overnight at any place other than your home without a reasonable excuse. The words overnight and at any place probably don't really fall for definition. Certainly they're not defined within the regulations. They're common English terms, and their interpretation within these regulations will really be informed by what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do under Regulation 7, which deals with gatherings. So we're going to come to those in a little while, but perhaps if we look at the amendments to Regulation 6.2 next. So I'm working on paper here as well as the digital version. So Regulation 6.2 is the list of situations which are expressly identified within the regs as providing a reasonable excuse for staying elsewhere overnight. And as you see, it broadly follows the lines of the previous version. It's still the Regulation 6 reasonable excuse list is not expressed to be an exhaustive list. The wording includes the following scenarios, but it's obviously harder to picture a scenario in which an overnight stay could be reasonably necessary than it is for short trips during the daytime. There are a greater range of opportunities for giving reasons for a short daytime trip, I would have thought. The regs now generally include express provision for the first time for elite athletes and their coaches, and if the athlete's under 18, for their parents, to do various things, include train at various specified places, and within Regulation 6 to stay elsewhere for the purposes of training or competition. The definition there is within Regulation 13AA. So if any of you want to take a moment and check whether you need to continue watching this webinar or whether you come within Regulation 13AA as an elite athlete, now's your chance to do so. And welcome back, all of you. So if we can go on to the next slide to see some specified exceptions to Regulation 6.1, prohibition on staying overnight elsewhere, which are likely to be of a bit more relevance to most of us. So the non-exhaustive list for reasonable excuses for staying overnight, it includes those set out there, and you'll see, broadly speaking, they mirror the exceptions that were set out in the previous version of the regs. If you're attending a funeral, you're moving house, you're a child and there are contact proceedings, or if you can't go home for various specified reasons. And over the page we see a few more of those. Perhaps. And so there again, if it's reasonably necessary for you to stay elsewhere for any of those specified purposes or to fulfill a legal obligation, then you are permitted to do so. And that's pretty straightforward in a sense. And so more interesting perhaps now are the amendments to Regulation 7, which is the regulation that restricts gatherings. So if we go to the next slide, we can see the scope of Regulation 7 and how that's changed over time. So that's the original Reg 7.1, which prohibited gatherings in a public place of more than 2 people, saving certain limited number of exceptions, and it was an exhaustive list of exceptions. The new Regulation 7.1 slightly more permissive in some ways, and that provides that unless paragraph 2 applies, we'll come to paragraph 2 of course, that's the list of specified exceptions, no person may participate in a gathering which takes place in a public or private place, either outdoors consisting of more than 6 persons or indoors and consisting of 2 or more persons. So a number of questions there are posed as to what those words mean, and the first and most obvious one covered on the next slide is, what is a gathering? Gathering had been used on the previous version of the regulations, but it hadn't previously been defined. There was a bit of debate going around about whether it needed to be, but broadly speaking it didn't matter so much then, because the reasons for leaving the home, permitted reasons for leaving the home, were so much more tightly defined. Now you can go out for pretty much any purpose, or for any purpose at all during the daytime at least. The focus shifts to Regulation 7 and the restrictions on gatherings, and so perhaps for that reason it has now been defined within the regs. And you find the definition in Regulation 7.3a, and it's set out on the screen there with a few words that are likely to be of particular relevance highlighted by me. As ever, when you try to define a simple word, you use other words, and sometimes the use of those other words leads to the need for further definition or further exploration. And so over the next page, or on the next slide, we'll see a few examples of that. So a gathering is when 2 or more people are present together in the same place in order to engage in any form of social interaction with each other, or to undertake any other activity with each other. So social interaction, why has that been included? Well, it may be that if the regulation had simply referred to any activity between individuals, it might have been thought to not include meeting a friend for a chat, meeting someone for a cup of tea, and so on. Those are obviously amount to social interaction. Whether they would be thought to amount to activity without more is perhaps the reason why social interaction has been included in there. But the point ultimately is that the drafting's obviously been designed to be comprehensive and catch pretty much any scenario in which two or more people may wish to meet. But there's another key phrase that's pretty much essential to understanding the definition of a gathering, because it's not a gathering unless you're undertaking activity with each other. It's very hard to socially interact without doing that with each other, but undertaking any other activity with each other is what's required in order for that activity among people to become a gathering. And so if you're in the same place, but you're engaged in a different activity from someone else, you're not interacting socially, you're not participating in a gathering within the terms of Regulation 7. How likely is that? Well, you can think of a scenario where two people are in the same room as each other. One might have gone round to visit a friend, and once they get to the same place, one sits on one sofa, the other sits on another. They take out their smartphones, put in their headphones, one's watching a film and the other one's playing a video game. Now, looked at from a sort of pure legal perspective, arguably that wouldn't amount to a gathering within Regulation 7, but plainly there's a degree of interaction there that's likely to infringe the guidance, which says effectively don't mix with people unless you really have to, and only in certain circumstances. So subject to that, I don't know how unlikely it is, but subject to that example, gathering is pretty comprehensive. If we go over to the next slide, we can look at another couple of key definitions, because indoors and outdoors makes a difference. And it's quite a big difference, because effectively you can't really gather with anybody else indoors, save for a pretty tightly defined list of circumstances, whereas outdoors at least up to 6 of you can meet for any purpose. Beyond 6, then you need to come within one of the specified exceptions. We'll come to those in a moment. What is indoors? It's defined in the regulations there with reference to Section 2 of the Health Act 2006 and the Smoke-Free Premises and Enforcement Regulations 2006. So we're all on familiar territory there, I would have thought. Well, happily, you don't need to check those regulations. I've done it for you. That's what we're here for. Enclosed is defined broadly in line with common usage. Substantially enclosed refers to premises which have a ceiling or roof and has a total area of openings in the walls which is less than half of the area of the walls. You can't get around that just by opening doors and windows. And just to sort of visualize that, if you have a garden table and you put a parasol up or some sort of canopy to cover it, then that is likely not to be a substantially enclosed premise within the terms of these regulations, because the total area of openings around the side is still going to be entire. Conversely, a shed or a summer house, something like that, even if there are a couple of windows or doors, and even if they are open, that's unlikely well, that would be prohibited as being substantially enclosed premises. And bandstand would be fine to seek shelter in with a friend, but other places, of course, wouldn't. Tents, in fact, are caught here because a ceiling or roof includes a canvas roof, so you can't get around the provision by meeting up with somebody on a rainy day inside a tent, unless it has no sides, which of course it might not be as good for protection. But that's indoors, outdoors, for what that is worth. And so you need to identify whether you are indoors or outdoors, because that defines how many people you can mix with, or whether you can mix or gather at all. Onto the next slide, we have the list of exceptions. And this is the new version of Regulation 7.2, which provides the only circumstances in which 2 people can gather indoors or more than 6 people can gather outdoors. So a pretty important list of exceptions, and it's an exhaustive list here. Unlike Regulation 6, it's an exhaustive list of exceptions, but the exceptions are for the similar purposes to those set out in Regulation 6. You can gather many members of the same household wherever you like, frankly, because of course the public health risk is contained. You can gather with no limit on numbers to attend a funeral, subject to being within one of the permitted categories of attendees. We've looked at those before. If you're a close family member, close friend, if no family members attending, or if it's a member of your household, you can attend. Elite athletes crop up again. If you're gathering with a coach and a parent, and the gathering is necessary for training or competition, so you could go, if they were holding them, you could go to an athletics meeting, I suppose, as the athlete or coach or parent. Legal obligation obviously covered. Educational facility, so that's a sort of new addition or a difference between Regulation 6. You can gather in whatever number you like at an educational facility if that gathering is reasonably necessary for educational purposes. And then there's the list, a further list, if the gathering is reasonably necessary for work purposes or any of those other specified exceptions there. So that means two people or more could gather indoors for work purposes, etc. More than 6 people could gather outdoors for work purposes if it was reasonably necessary to do so. And on the next slide, in fact, if we skip onto the slide following this one, please, Andrew, because I deal here with the work exception. How's that likely to operate indoors? There's been a bit of talk online on Twitter and so on about what that would permit and what it wouldn't permit. You only need, the first point is you only need to get into the exceptions if there's a gathering in the first place. So if you are somebody who has a cleaner who comes round to your house, or if you're a cleaner who goes round to people's houses, you're not participating in a gathering when that happens, because the cleaner and the person whose house it is are not engaged in that activity with each other. That's not a gathering. They're not engaged in the same activity together. Ditto a handyman and so on. They're not gathering. So you don't even get into looking at the work exception. But if there is a gathering, it needs to be reasonably necessary for work purposes, if that is the exception you want to bring yourself within. Now, query, does it need to be necessary from the perspective of all participants for work purposes? I think it probably does, because if you are, you need to be engaged in the same activity in order to engage this exception in the first place, in order to come within Regulation 7. And so I don't think you can get around it by saying, well, so-and-so is working and I am participating in activity with that worker in some way. Similarly, do all participants need to be working? Again, I think so. So it seems to me, I may be wrong, this is my opinion, my reading of the regulations broadly consistent with the advice, I think, but the regulation as drafted probably doesn't permit indoors visits from personal trainers, masseurs, manicurists, whoever else you might have to come round, who might conceivably be engaging in an activity with you, but where they are working and you are not. I don't see that as coming within the work exception. I might be wrong, but that's certainly my assessment of it. There's a suggestion that's been made that has come to my attention, that of course one of the exceptions that might have been there but isn't is that you can't have a partner who lives alone from you, apart from you, come round and visit. And there was a witty suggestion doing the rounds that, well, perhaps you could if you paid them. It doesn't seem to me that that would work, because it wouldn't be work for both of you, and so that's an illustration of the artificiality of that type of exercise. Going to the previous slide to deal with some questions more likely to be relevant before we finish. If you visit your friends and family in your back garden, can you go through the house? Well, the guidance, of course, take your steer principally from the guidance, but this is about what you can and can't do legally. The guidance says you can, sensibly enough, you may think, but legally, the reason why I think you can do that is arguably not a gathering at that stage. if you're processing through the house for the purpose of meeting effectively and engaging in your social interaction elsewhere. You can have barbecues or picnics up to the limit, provided they're outdoors. You can use the toilet of somebody else's house. I think the reason why you can do that, of course, it's in the guidance, of course, it's common sense, is that it's not social interaction between you and somebody else, and neither are you likely to be engaging in that with each other. So you don't even get into the question of a gathering there. Legally, you don't need to stay 2 meters apart, but of course there's the advice. And if you're barbecuing, obviously you follow all the public health advice that's out there, including make sure your sausages are cooked through and cook on the coals rather than the flames, etc. If it rains, you need to find shelter that's not substantially enclosed, so you could put up an awning. You couldn't go inside the shed, or you could go home, or you could get wet. The inventive of you, who wanted to take things to the absolute limit, might think about regulation 7.2d6. I'm sure it was the thing that you were just about to mention to yourselves. He hasn't done it yet. And that is the exception that permits gathering to enable one or more persons in the gathering to avoid injury or illness, or to escape a risk of harm. You may say, well, look, it started raining, I might catch a cold if I cycled home in the rain. You may say, it's raining too badly for me to see clearly enough to drive, particularly if you already had some concerns about the quality of your eyesight. We know that may happen from time to time. But broadly speaking, you understand the way that the legislation is drawn. One question I got asked this morning when I was discussing this with some people is, are you allowed to protest? There's no exception in Regulation 7 for gathering for the purposes of protest. And that's right, and it's an exhaustive list of exceptions. So what that means is you could gather in a group of 6 to protest, and there's plainly, for very good reason, protests going on as I speak here. Beyond 6, it would fall outside the scope of the regulations, and so would technically amount to an offence, but hopefully the police will be adopting their light touch policing operative policy for that as much as everything else, particularly at the moment. So that is what you can and can't do pretty much as a whistle-stop tour of the new regulations 6 and 7. And the important point is that the focus really shifts from regulation 6 to regulation 7. It's more about the purposes for which you can gather, how many people are together, where you're gathering. And there's likely to be further changes, obviously, in due course. Hopefully, what we'll see is continued relaxation of the restrictions, obviously, all dependent on whether the specified purpose directs that the restrictions are relaxed or tightened. Obviously, take the slides, consider them, any questions, let me know if you still have time. But until next time, stay safe and well, and hopefully there'll be an update about hairdressers within the next few weeks. Thank you very much. Back to Andrew in the studio.
Thank you, Dominic. Thank you everybody for sticking with us. Next week, when I hope we will do a slightly better job at sticking to our time slot, we've got 2 further talks. Robin Shellard talking about mandatory minimum sentencing and firearms. What do you mean 5 years? It's legal in Europe. And Tom Quinton speaking about account freezing orders. Until then, as Dominic says, please stay safe and we will see you next week. Bye for now.